Sagittarius, the small thing my mother left behind. The echo left inside a small thing. Sometimes, Sagittarius, the things we understand last are the things that were closest to us all our lives. A mother's silence. A gesture we never questioned. A small object left behind, too ordinary to notice, too heavy once we understand it. Welcome back, my dear Sagittarius souls, to another quiet night with Zodiac wisdom, where we don't rush healing, we simply allow stories to open the doors we have kept closed for too long. Tonight's story is not loud. It doesn't arrive with dramatic losses or grand revelations. It begins the way real life often does, with something tiny, something unremarkable, something we only understand after life has taken away the person who once touched it every day. And maybe that is the hardest truth for a Sagittarius. You who always searches for meaning, for the wider sky, for the arrow that points toward freedom and clarity. Because sometimes the truth you've been looking for is tucked inside the smallest corner of your childhood. Inside something your mother left behind without ever explaining why. Tonight I want to take you into a story that smells of old wooden drawers, of winter light falling on a quiet room, of the sound a heart makes when it realizes it might have misunderstood someone it loved more than anything. A story about a daughter, a Sagittarius, and a small item her mother left for her. An item she never opened, never examined, because grief can make our hands heavy and our truths even heavier. But the moment she finally touches it, the moment she allows herself to really see, a doorway opens. Not just into her mother's past, but into her own. This is not a lesson, not a moral compass, not a lecture about gratitude or forgiveness. It is simply an invitation to breathe, to feel, to remember, and to let your heart be brave enough to look at the things you have avoided. So settle in, Sagittarius. Let the story begin like the soft opening of a film. No rush, no answers yet. Just the quiet truth that sometimes what our mothers leave behind is not a thing, but a part of themselves waiting for us to finally see it. Map 1. The city where her mother's voice still lingered. Winter had always arrived quietly in her city, slipping between the buildings with a pale, hesitant light. On mornings like this, everything felt softened, coated in a thin veil of silver that made even familiar streets look slightly unreal. And in that delicate quiet, Alara, a 37-year-old Sagittarius woman, finally walked toward the apartment she had avoided for nearly 9 months. She didn't know what changed. Maybe grief had shifted shape. Maybe silence had grown too heavy. Or maybe she had simply run out of ways to stay away from the truth waiting for her inside those walls. The building stood at the end of a narrow lane where old balconies leaned toward each other like tired friends. When she unlocked the door, the familiar creak greeted her. The same sound she grew up with, the same sound she imagined she'd hear forever. But today it vibrated differently. It echoed. The living room was frozen in time. Her mother's scarf still hung on the back of the chair. A book lay open on the coffee table, its spine softened by years of reading. The air smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that felt like a hand brushing gently across her shoulder. Alara stood still for a long moment. She didn't cry. Sagittarius rarely break at the first touch of memory. They hold themselves upright, studying the pain before letting it in. She placed her bag down, touched the edge of the sofa, the surface of the shelf, the cool porcelain figurine her mother used to dust every Sunday morning. Everything was so familiar it hurt. When she stepped into the bedroom, the world seemed to grow quieter. Winter light filtered through the curtains, thin and almost shy, casting long shadows across the floorboards. And there on the nightstand, beneath a small porcelain bird, sat a wooden box. It was simple, dark, worn at the corners, carved with a pattern she didn't recognize. She picked it up. The box was light, lighter than she expected, as though it held something small yet impossibly delicate. A pulse of something moved through her. Not fear but recognition. Her mother had kept many things but not this. Alara had never seen it before. That alone felt like a whisper from another lifetime. She didn't open it. Her fingers rested on the lid, but she couldn't lift it. Not yet. Instead, she moved to the balcony, letting the cold air hit her face. The scent of roasted chestnuts drifted from the vendor below, the same one her mother used to visit on winter evenings. For a moment she felt 13 again, standing beside her mother, hands warmed by a small paper bag, listening to her laugh at something Alara had already forgotten. That laugh. How long had it been since she heard it? How long had it been since she tried to remember? When she turned back into the room, her eyes fell to the wooden box again. It didn't look mysterious. It didn't look dramatic. It simply looked intentional, placed where she would one day find it, at a time her mother somehow knew she would be ready. Elara returned to the bed, sat down slowly, and held the box in her lap. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything unsaid between her and the woman who raised her. Growing up, her mother had been gentle yet distant, loving yet private. She had warmth, yes, but also a quiet ache behind her eyes, as if she carried stories she never shared. Elara always sensed that shadow, never threatening but present, like a room in the house she was never invited into. Now the key to that room might be resting in her hands. She closed her eyes, inhaled the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the sheets, and whispered into the stillness, "Mom, what did you want me to know?" The winter light stretched across her lap, illuminating the carvings on the box as though urging her forward. In that moment something softened inside her. A recognition, a readiness, a surrender. The story, long delayed and tenderly waiting, was finally beginning to move. Map 2. When memory begins to speak. Elara didn't open the box right away. She placed it on the bed beside her, letting her fingertips rest on its surface as though warming it with her presence. The room felt smaller than before, as if her mother's absence had folded the space inward. For a moment, she simply breathed, letting the silence steady her. When she finally lifted the lid, the hinges released a soft, almost reluctant sigh. Inside lay a few small items wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just small, ordinary things. Yet each one carried a pulse of something familiar and forgotten. The first thing she unfolded was a key. A tiny brass key, tarnished but still holding a subtle shine. It didn't belong to any drawer or box, Elara remembered. She turned it in her hand, feeling the grooves, the weight. Her mother had always been careful with her things. Why hide a key? Underneath the key was a folded slip of paper. Not quite a note, not quite a letter. The kind of thing someone writes when they don't know where to begin. Her mother's handwriting, curved, steady, unmistakable, covered only a single line. "For when you are ready to see me clearly." Elara froze. The words were simple, but they cut through years of unasked questions. She set the paper down carefully, as though it might crumble if she touched it too quickly. Her breath came slowly, unevenly. Ready to see me clearly. What did that mean? She unfolded the next piece of tissue. Inside was a small pendant necklace, silver, delicate, with a tiny engraving she had never noticed before. Her mother used to wear this pendant on special occasions, but Elara had always thought of it as just a piece of jewelry. Now in her hands it felt heavier. She tilted it toward the light. The engraving became visible, 2 dates separated by a hyphen. It wasn't her mother's birthday. It wasn't her grandmother's. And it certainly wasn't Elara's. For a long moment, she just stared at the numbers, feeling something stir inside her. An unease, a familiarity, a question she didn't yet know how to form. She placed the pendant down and unfolded the last item. It was a photograph. A small, worn photograph, the edges frayed as if it had been held many times. 2 women stood side by side. One was unmistakably her mother, in her 20s, smiling the way she rarely did later in life. The other woman, Elara had never seen her. A wave of warmth for the mother she once knew, and a sharp ache for the version she never understood, washed through her. The presence of the second woman felt significant, almost heavy. Her mother had saved this photo for decades. She had wrapped it carefully. She had placed it in a box meant for Elara. Why? Elara traced her mother's younger face with her thumb, feeling the softness of lost time. She tried to recall any moment, any hint, that her mother might have been close to someone like the woman in the photo. But memory is tricky, especially memory shaped by childhood. Children see their parents as constants, as fixtures, not as people who existed before them. They rarely consider that their mother had entire chapters long before they took their first breath. A thought crossed her mind, quiet but sharp. Maybe I never really knew her. And that was where the insight slipped in, soft, hidden, but impossible to ignore. As a Sagittarius, Elara had always sought the bigger picture, always looked for meaning beyond the surface. But when it came to her mother, she had clung to the surface because it felt safer. Her mother had been the sun of her childhood, Warm, distant, blinding. When someone means that much, sometimes you don't dare look too closely. You love the version you can handle. She held the photograph again. The second woman's smile was gentle, almost protective. They stood close, closer than friends. A closeness Alara could feel even through the faded paper. For a moment she imagined the story behind it. Two young women, laughter between them, secrets shared, something important binding them. She wondered what her mother felt when the picture was taken. Hope? Freedom? Love? And then she felt the other layer beneath her imagination. She was starting to paint things again. Just like she always did. Just like Sagittarius hearts tend to do when reality feels too bare. But this time she caught herself. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the present moment, in what she actually held. Not assumptions, not narratives, just the truth she could touch. The truth was simple. Her mother had a story she never told. And this box was the doorway into that story. Alara sat back against the headboard, the photograph resting on her knee, the key still in her palm. The winter light flickered slightly as clouds moved across the sky, casting shifting shadows across the bed. She felt as though she were watching a film she had unknowingly been a character in for years, but had never seen the beginning of. Gradually, she began to understand that this wasn't just about uncovering something about her mother. It was also about uncovering the parts of herself shaped by what she didn't know. Her longing, her projections, the invisible ache she carried without a name. The box, the key, the pendant, the photograph, they weren't answers. They were invitations. Gently crafted signposts from a woman who had loved her in the quietest ways, hoping that one day Alara would be brave enough to open them. And now she was. Or at least she was trying to be. The city outside grew colder, the light dimming, but inside the room something warmer had awakened. Not clarity yet, but movement. A shift in her heart, in her understanding, in the story she thought she knew. Whatever came next, she knew this. Nothing about her mother had ever been simple. And nothing about the truth waiting ahead would be either. But she was ready to walk toward it. Map 3. The moment the truth began to breathe, evening settled slowly over the apartment, turning the room into a soft blend of amber and shadow. Alara hadn't moved for a long time. The photograph, the pendant, the key, they all lay beside her on the bed, forming a small constellation of mysteries she could feel but not yet name. Grief has a strange way of bending time. Minutes stretched, memories stirred, and her mother's presence felt both impossibly far and achingly close. She lifted the pendant again, turning it between her fingers as the engraved dates glinted faintly in the dim light. 2 dates. A beginning and an ending. But of what? Of whom? And why had her mother never worn it around her later in life? The question rattled in her chest, pushing her up from the bed. Sagittarius women don't sit still when the truth calls. They move instinctively, driven by a hunger to understand what others avoid. So she crossed the room, opened the wardrobe her mother once used, and searched through its quiet corners. Halfway down behind stacks of folded scarves she found it. A small metal box, old-fashioned and locked. Her heart kicked against her ribs. The brass key in her pocket suddenly felt heavier. She hesitated only a breath before sliding the key into the lock. Fit perfectly. The click echoed through the room. Not loud but deep, like something shifting inside her. She lifted the lid. Inside were papers, letters, documents, and at the very top another photograph, newer than the first. 2 women again, her mother a little older now, and the same woman from the earlier picture, standing beside her with a closeness that wasn't just affection. It was devotion. Alara sat on the floor, the box balanced on her knees, and carefully unfolded one of the letters. It was written in the same handwriting as the note in the wooden box, her mother's handwriting. Lines slanted with emotion, ink slightly smudged as though touched by uncertain fingers. I don't know how to live a truth that others are not ready to see. Her breath caught. She read on. We loved each other quietly. We had to. The world didn't give us room for anything louder. I wanted to tell you when you were older, but I didn't know how. I didn't want you to carry the weight I had carried. Alara's throat tightened. A silence filled her chest that felt nothing like emptiness, more like recognition, understanding, a truth she hadn't expected, yet one that felt strangely familiar, like a puzzle piece that had always belonged but had never been lifted into place. Her mother loved a woman, loved her deeply, loved her quietly, loved her long before Ilara was old enough to understand love in any form. The pendant, the dates, they were not the markers of her mother's life. They belonged to the woman in the photograph. The woman her mother had spent years loving from the edges of her life, in the silent spaces society carved out for people like them. Ilara pressed her hand over her mouth, not to stifle a sob, but to contain the flood of emotion that rose unexpectedly, not pain but tenderness. A tenderness for the woman her mother once was, the woman she had never seen clearly until now. She continued reading. If you are holding this, then I am gone. And I need you to know this one thing. I loved you, but I lived half of my life hiding. Not because I wanted to hide from you, but because I didn't want to break the world you grew up in. I hope one day you will forgive me for the silence. Forgive her? Ilara shook her head slowly. All she could feel was a growing, aching admiration. Because suddenly she could see it, the quiet sorrow behind her mother's smiles, the softness wrapped in caution, the depth Ilara always sensed but never understood. Her mother wasn't distant. She was wounded, and she was protecting something: herself, her love, her daughter, all at once. The moment the truth settled inside her, something shifted. Not broken, not shattered, just rearranged. She thought about all the time she'd painted her mother as unknowable, unreachable, quietly mysterious. She thought about her own tendency as a Sagittarius to project meaning onto people, onto the smallest details, the briefest gestures, creating versions of them that lived only in her mind. She realized something she hadn't seen until now. She had done that with her mother too. She had built a version of her, a gentle, strong but distant woman who simply kept things to herself. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was deeper, more human, more fragile. Her mother wasn't distant by nature. She was distant by necessity. The realization washed over her in a slow, trembling wave. She didn't feel betrayed. She felt honored. Honored to be trusted with the truth her mother had carried alone for so long. As she gathered the letters, the photos, the small pieces of a life hidden inside a metal box, Ilara felt something warm spread through her chest. A feeling she hadn't experienced since her mother died. It wasn't closure. Not yet. It was connection. A connection not built on childhood memories or idealized versions, but on the truth of who her mother really was. A woman who loved deeply, who hid gently, and who left behind just enough for her daughter to finally see her clearly. And for the first time in months, Ilara whispered into the quiet room, not as a grieving daughter, but as someone finally meeting her mother anew. I see you now. Map 4. The Anatomy of a Sagittarius Heart. Ilara sat on the floor long after the last letter had slipped from her hands. The room felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, just truer. And in that truth, something in her began to open. Not the part that belonged to her mother, the part that belonged to her. Because understanding someone else, especially someone as close as a mother, always forces you to face yourself too. And the more she breathed through the revelation, the more she realized she hadn't only misunderstood her mother. She had misunderstood herself. Sagittarius hearts are built from fire and horizon. They love deeply, but they look far. They seek meaning the way others seek comfort. And when something hurts, they don't break open immediately. They retreat into distance, into logic, into explanations that feel safer than raw feeling. Ilara had done that all her life, especially with her mother. As she sat there, she saw something with piercing clarity. She hadn't avoided the truth of her mother out of neglect. She had avoided it out of fear. Fear of seeing the shadows in someone she loved so fiercely. Fear of realizing that the person she depended on was also human. Flawed, vulnerable, quietly bleeding behind her smiles. Sagittarius idealization is subtle. It's not about worship. It's about hope. They take the traits they admire: strength, gentleness, resilience, and they expand them, stretch them across a person until they become a whole identity. Not to blind themselves, but to protect themselves from confronting the ache of reality. To love the light in others without having to face the shadows that come with it. That was what Ilara had done. She hadn't painted her mother as perfect. She was too honest for that. But she had painted her as simple, as consistent, as someone who chose silence because that was just who she was. The truth was far more intricate. Her mother wasn't simple. She was layered, complicated, courageous in her own quiet, wounded way. And for the first time, Alara allowed herself to feel the weight of those layers. She realized how often Sagittarius minds project meaning onto things when clarity is uncomfortable. A sigh becomes disappointment. A silence becomes distance. A tired smile becomes emotional unavailability. They fill in gaps with stories that allow them to keep moving forward without having to pause long enough to ask, what if this person is carrying something I know nothing about? That tendency had woven itself through her entire relationship with her mother. Her mother's privacy wasn't rejection. It was protection. Her mother's quietness wasn't emotional distance. It was the residue of a love she wasn't allowed to live openly. Her mother's unspoken truths weren't failures. They were scars. And how often do Sagittarius children miss the wounds in the people they love because they're too busy trying to be strong? Alara pressed her palms to her eyes, feeling tears finally surface, not for the secrecy, but for the loneliness her mother must have carried. For all the mornings she woke beside an emptiness the world forced her to accept. For all the time she folded her truth into silence so her daughter wouldn't inherit her burden. Sagittarius hearts struggle with vulnerability. Not the outward kind, the inner kind. The kind that requires them to admit they misread someone, or that they projected their fears onto others, or that hope sometimes blinded them more than it guided them. And as Alara sat surrounded by pieces of her mother's hidden life, she saw the pattern, not just in her relationship with her mother, but in every relationship she'd ever had. The partners she idealized, the friendships she romanticized, the people she believed were deeper, wiser, more emotionally available than they actually were. She loved the potential of people because potential was safer than reality. Potential was untouched, unbroken, untainted. Reality was fragile, and fragility frightened her. But her mother's truth, this quiet, brave, forbidden truth, shattered that fear gently, like light breaking through a window she didn't know was locked. Her mother had been real, not perfect, not ideal, not a projection, a real woman with real sorrows and real love. And for the first time, Alara understood the cost of loving someone without seeing all of them. You end up losing them before they're gone. A long breath left her chest, slow, shaky, honest. She realized that for years she had loved her mother's surface because she was afraid of what lay underneath. Sagittarius often fear the truths that can't be fixed, can't be changed, can't be outrun. They prefer to rewrite the story in their minds rather than face an ache they couldn't soothe. But healing, real healing, requires seeing the truth as it is, not as the heart wishes it were. Alara looked again at the photograph of her mother, and the woman she loved. They stood close, smiling in a way she had rarely seen. There was a tenderness in her mother's eyes that Alara had never recognized before. Not because it wasn't there, but because she had never looked closely enough to see it. In that moment, she felt her mother's life open to her. Not through memories but through truth. A quiet truth, a brave truth, a human truth. And that truth whispered back to her, as soft as her mother's voice once was. You never truly lose someone once you finally see them. Map 5. Walking out of the shadows into her mother's truth. Alara sat with the opened letters spread gently around her, as though they were no longer secrets but living pieces of the woman she had loved all her life. The truth didn't feel sharp anymore. It didn't slice or crush. It glowed, softly, quietly, like a lantern placed inside her chest, illuminating everything she once misunderstood. She gathered the letters back into the box, not to hide them again, but to hold them with reverence, and realized that something inside her had shifted. Her mother was no longer a distant figure wrapped in silence, someone she failed to understand. She was suddenly whole, suddenly human, suddenly seen. And with that seeing came a gentle, unmistakable release. A release from the stories she had painted. A release from the distance she thought her mother created. A release from the ache of believing she was left out of something. She wasn't left out. She simply hadn't looked closely enough. As she stood on the balcony afterward, winter night unfolding over the city, she felt her heart approach a truth Sagittarius people rarely say out loud. Sometimes the stories we create hurt us more than the truths we avoid. For years, she had imagined her mother as quiet, impenetrable, resigned to a life of muted emotions. But that wasn't real. Her mother had been brave, tender, full of a love the world didn't know how to hold. And as the cold air brushed her skin, Elara felt her own internal landscape rearrange. She understood now that part of growing up, truly growing up, is learning to love people as they are, not as the idealized shapes we project onto them. Sagittarius hearts often love the future, inside someone, the potential, the ideal, the hope. But with her mother, that habit had blinded her to the depth that was already there. Her mother didn't need to become anything more. She had simply needed to be seen. Later, when Elara placed the wooden box back on the bed, she made a quiet promise to herself, to love with her eyes open, to stop confusing projection with connection, to stop mistaking silence for distance, to stop assuming she already knew someone just because she loved them. The healing didn't feel dramatic. It didn't arrive like a revelation or a vow. It felt like softening, like the loosening of a knot she had carried in her chest for years. She knew she couldn't speak to her mother anymore, couldn't ask the questions she once feared, couldn't offer the understanding she now held. But she could allow this truth to reshape her life going forward. She could let it make her gentler with the people she loved. She could let it make her braver with her own truths. She could let it make her more willing to step into the shadows of others, instead of turning away when things became complicated or unclear. And if she could speak to her mother now, if the sky could part even for 1 second, she knew exactly what she would say. "I wish I had seen you sooner, but I see you now." And she knew exactly what her mother would answer. "That's enough."